Our speaker tonight is Mr. Reed Buckley, son of the oil explorer William F. Buckley, and the younger brother of Senator James Buckley of New York and William F. Buckley, Jr., editor-in-chief of the National Review. The author of The Eye of the Hurricane, a novel stressing the ecological depredation Americans have committed on nature and their own spiritual heritage, Mr. Buckley has contributed to Vogue, Diplomat, The Atlantic Monthly, Life, National Review, and other magazines. He himself has been an assistant to the editor of Freeman Magazine, a contributing editor of National Review under the pen name of Peter Crumpet, and the literary contributing editor of Triumph Magazine. He has currently finished a novel on morals and manners set in Spain, as well as 4 screenplays, one of which is currently under production. Schooled in England, Mexico, and the United States, Mr. Buckley took his A.B. degree from Yale University in 1952, distinguishing himself there as a debater, editor, and writer. He now lives in Spain, where he resided in 1958 with his wife and 4 children. It is now my pleasure at the present time to introduce Mr. Reed Buckley, whose topic will be, Does Liberalism Doom Society?
Thank you. I was listening to the radio program this afternoon trying to get some more news on what may have happened in China, which I think is rather fascinating, on the sudden demise of the defense minister. But all I could get was a Canadian station in French, and my French is rusty. And they kept talking about Nixon's Fuzz 2 economic policy. And I gather that once again the mafia has won the day. Because as you remember, I think you remember that about 2 months ago, a prostitute wrote in to ask whether she could raise her fee. And she was told that no, under phase 1, she could not raise her fee. But tonight I understand that they've made a decision that used products don't come under phase 2 as far as the control of profits and wages are concerned. Lecture agents are sadists, as I suppose some of you know. I had a 5 or 10 minute conference with mine before this current tour for three and a half weeks ago. And he said, Reed, he's a very hearty bluff man. He said, Reed, he said, I have good news for you and bad news for you. Which would you care for first? And I said, well, give me the good news. I always like good news. He said, well, I'm sending you among the bookings. I've got a booking for Hoover's Women's College. And he said, Reed, they are collectively the most beautiful undergraduate body you have ever seen in your life. And I said, well, that's fine. I said, what's the bad news? And he said, well, remember, you're married. So then he said to me, what other news do you want? I said, well, tell me. He said, well, I've got some good news. And I said, tell me that. He said, I have you booked into Knoxville, Tennessee. And I said, well, that's fine. And he said, well, I thought you'd like it because I know your esteem for sour mash, and that's the heart of sour mash whiskey. And I said, okay, what's the bad news? And he said, well, the bad news is that it's dry. So I said, fine, where else do you have me booked? And he said, well, I've got you in Iowa, and I know you like the heartland of America. And I said, what's the bad news? And he said, there's none. He said, in fact, it's civilized. And I want to thank the reception committee this afternoon and this evening because it certainly was more than civilized. Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, and those of us who aspire to that lofty estate, legions of the Double X Brigade and us poor beleaguered ex-wires, it's sometimes difficult to get across the conservative case in the United States, particularly, I don't know why, but particularly in universities. And this has always puzzled me because presumably universities are institutions of learning. But I had trouble, I remember, in St. Louis, not too far from here, 3 years ago, when I was asked to give a talk on the resurrection of the human spirit. And as I began the talk, a freak came in and he sat in the front row, which is very close, and he glared at me, glared balefully at me. And as I began, he unfolded a newspaper and spread it as widely as he could, and then sort of stuck his face ostentatiously behind it. So that lasted for the balance of the talk, and since it was an informal session, before the questions and answers period, I got off the podium and lit a cigarette. And as I lit it in passing, I lit his newspaper in two. Now, this apparently turned him on, because he came to me afterwards and he said, "I'm sorry about that, Mr. Buckley." He said, "but when you mentioned the word spirit, I just went cold." So that I was 38 years old then, and I figured, gee, I've only got a couple more years before I'm condemned to a geriatrics ward. So I thought, I got to relate, I got to communicate and that kind of thing. And I searched desperately for a metaphor. And finally, I lit upon one. I said to him, "Have you ever experienced the sensation of speed?" And he said, "Yeah, man." I said, "Oh, you have?" And I went on. Of course, I was thinking of sort of tight turns on skis and when your sled went down a nice hill, and didn't realize until a lot later that we were talking on different wavelengths. This kind of problem isn't singular in the 20th century. I was reading a couple of months ago a long biography, 3 volumes on Lord Byron, who isn't worth 3 volumes, I don't think. But in this biography, they talked about Ben Jonson for some reason or other, and they told a story that I've come to love. Apparently, Ben Jonson was hounded by a mediocrity called Sylvester, who was a poet. And Sylvester thought that he could get some fame and some renown if he managed to corner Ben Jonson in a coffee shop. And he finally did. And when he cornered him in this coffee shop, he challenged Ben Jonson to a rhyming couplet contest. So finally, Ben Jonson said, "All right, Sylvester, you begin." And Sylvester began. He said, "I, Sylvester, slept with your sister." Ben Jonson thought for a few moments, and he said, "Well, I, Ben Jonson, slept with your wife." And Sylvester said, "But Mr. Jonson, that doesn't rhyme." And Jonson said, "I know, but it's the truth." In the opening volume of his great and intriguing work, Order and History, philosopher-historian Eric Voegelin states the central paradox of what we like to call the human condition. Man, he says, is the only creature in existence capable of an objective analysis of being. Yet since he is himself a drop in that great stream, he's necessarily subjective and can't come to an objective understanding either of himself or of his relationship to other men or of his relationship to society. This, the staggering ontological paradox, states the conservative caveat, the conservative warning, namely, that the comprehension of man is limited, his understanding imperfect, his rational faculties far from infallible, and whatever he may think at any given moment in history is more likely to prove erroneous than not. The conservative believes in his essential fallibility, which is why he hearkens to the lessons of history with rigorous respect in order to avoid being condemned by history, which is why he applies these historical lessons to his independent construing of the present in order to broaden the base of his comprehension, and which is why he's so keenly concerned with the consequences of what he does now on an unknowable future. Unlike so many liberals, the conservative is loath to fetter the future with laws and institutions beyond the absolute minimum necessary for an irenic society. And he's especially suspicious of hasty laws aimed at present and perhaps transient need that may tend to institutionalize an ill-chosen course. As an example of institutionalization of such a course, you can have, for example, the minimum wage laws, any slur on which sets off ideological hooting and hollering from liberals, almost as though we conservatives were impugning the virtue of Whistler's mother. The minimum wage is an unmitigated evil. The minimum wage is a cruel measure of comfort only to our monopolies, to our labor union monopolies, but a catastrophe for the young, for the unskilled, and members of the minority races. Statistics prove this. Between 1950 and 1960, when the minimum wage doubled, Negro unemployment soared from 15% to 25% at the very same time that general unemployment was dropping from 5.5% to 3.8%. In 1970, Job losses attributable directly to the minimum wage were estimated at 751,000 annually, and when in February of 1969, the minimum wage went up from $1.40 to $1.60, unemployment for young men 16 through 19 years old scored at 11%, whereas general adult unemployment was scoring only 1.9%. And with that raise, 400,000 people were thrown out of work down south and migrated to northern cities there to swell the welfare ranks. And in New York City alone, 50,000 people awoke to find themselves without jobs and on relief at the taxpayer's expense. Such sorry results were predicted by conservatives. The evidence is clear and available for anyone to read, and some eminent liberals, such as Daniel P. Moynihan and Professor Edward C. Banfield, have in fact digested that evidence and have called for revision or abandonment of the statutory minimum wage. But the great majority of liberals remain frozen in the dogmas of their ideology. Liberals refuse to face up to the illogic, the patent failure, and the, in fact, cruel consequence of their program. They've institutionalized the minimum wage, and we are, in fact and indeed, stuck with it. The conservative is a cautious creature. Persuaded of man's essential fallibility, he distrusts all ideologies and all concentrations of power through which man's built-in capacity for error is the more likely to wreak harm. Eric Voegelin says of ideology that it is existence in rebellion against God and man, and to this we agree. Notoriously, liberals tend to be the creatures of ideology, existentialists in rebellion against God and man, that is, in rebellion against the transcendent and natural realities, and intolerant of the fickle, fingent, fumbling human beings they would like to regulate. The conservative believes in every man's right to go to hell and make it to heaven on his own, consistent with that order necessary for the preservation of that right. He's suspicious of, and he fights, the ideology that would like to call the shots for everyone. For this reason, he rejects the liberals' creed of a planned and collectivized society. The conservative knows that such a society is inhuman. As such, it goes against the grain of reality. Hence, its programs won't work unless one is willing to resort to totalitarianism. In a republic, such programs will tend always to boomerang. Take as an instance of that ideological basis for bad programs, urban renewal. Partial to the liberals' ideological creed is that the government must do everything and is able to solve all problems. We have poor people in need of better housing, we have slums. Liberals ignored the dictum that it is in fact people who make slums, that the root of the problem lies in the spiritual deprivation of slum dwellers, not in their physical environment, and that to attack the latter without concurrently relieving the former is to have achieved nothing. Edward Banfield writes eloquently about this, by the way, in his latest book, The Unheavenly City. But liberals further ignored that of all choices for getting things done, government is the very worst. Professor Peter Drucker, yet another enlightened liberal, writes in the winter '69 edition of The Public Interest, what every conservative is born knowing, that precisely government is by nature not a doer. And what are the results of urban renewal? The National Commission on Urban Problems, a liberal commission, noted that only 1/6 of the public housing units authorized by Congress since 1949 had actually been built. Morton Anderson estimates that in the decade 1950-1960, urban renewal projects encouraged the construction of some 28,000 dwelling units, while 126,000 were torn down. Richard Cleward, the professor of the Columbia University School of Social Research, has declared, and I quote him, "Since the public housing program was legislated in 1933, the net loss in low-income housing is probably 250,000 units. That is, our geniuses on the federal planning boards tore down 1 million units and only replaced them with 750,000, leaving an awful lot of people without a roof over their heads." And Professor Nathan Glazer, writing in the summer '67 issue of The Public Interest, stated, and I quote him, "Urban renewal has unquestionably reduced the quantity of low-cost housing and has raised rents for the poor." Despite which miserable record, typical of government programs, urban renewal has become a sacred cow, and dry though its dugs are, the congealed liberal, the ideologue, defends it in the universities and in Congress won't hear of axing or even reducing the program. It's by virtue of his philosophy that the liberal ends in becoming antisocial. Following from the ontological paradox I mentioned earlier, conservatives conceive of nature as both noetic and beyond cognition, as apprehendable and yet immanent with unknown and even unknowable meaning, as phenomenal and noumenal on all levels of apperception, and so as dual, material and spiritual. This alone separates us from Jacobinism and its descendants such as Marxists, neo-Marxists, fascists, Fabians, and Ayn Rand objectivists. We believe that man, a particle of nature, a being within nature, shares the duality of nature. Man is at once spiritual and material, and if either element goes out of whack, it will inevitably hurt the other. We try to maintain a balance between these two sides of man. We believe, nevertheless, in an hierarchy of values, placing higher importance on the spirit than the body. Material poverty is evil primarily because it tends to degrade the spirit. But spiritual poverty is yet more evil because it leaves people helpless in contending with their material condition. Socrates, when he was fighting for his life before the Athenian Senate, reminded his judges that virtue does not come from money, but from virtue come money and every other good of man. We agree. We feel that the proper object of government is to foster the good society, not the society of goods. The business of government is providing justice, not housing. The business of government is securing, defending, and propagating freedom for its citizens, not regimenting them at every turn. Since no human individual, nor no projection of his ego, namely an ideology, is infallible, we tend to opt for that society permitting as much personal choice as possible, which is why we view all government with a catawampus eye, which is why we promote subsidiarity, the principle of government holding that no higher echelon should do what a lower echelon can do better, which is why we promote subsidiarity and decentralization of power whenever we're able, and which is why we seek to maximize each individual's freedom, a good that lies within the spiritual order, and as a corollary and consequence, his personal responsibility for himself and for his neighbor. To relieve him of that responsibility, or in any form to restrict it, as liberals continually propose doing through their programs, is to strip that citizen of his liberty. Society is weakened to the bone. Bit by bit is a citizen morally undermined, his rights and obligations as an autonomous man able to bear the burden of freedom assumed from him, so that he becomes a ward of the state in which only the government is free, but the people more and more slaves. The process is ineluctable, and short of revolution if it goes too far, irreversible. Historically, within any society, there's a bias toward or away from liberty. Paradoxically, the liberal philosophy is that which, under the guise of benevolence, militates against freedom. Because he who assumes for you the burden of your existential risk as a sovereign and responsible citizen has indeed concomitantly assumed the privilege of abridging your personal liberty, because you are, in fact, no longer responsible, no longer a citizen sovereign in the determination of your personal destiny, and therefore, naturally, you are become a citizen in name only. You are, in reality, a ward. It's for this reason, the conservatives' recognition of the deep interrelationship between freedom and responsibility, that we oppose such concepts as Social Security. Now, there's a lot else to be said against the present Social Security program, such as the fact that it is fraudulent, that it does not work, which is perfectly true. But we're against it primarily because Social Security is an attack on that basic freedom of the individual to affect his own destiny. Social Security is in fact one of the items or programs in the government that create a balance whereby the citizen is considered a derivative of the state and something to be handled by the state. We're against this sort of idea because we feel that historically no government, no ruling elite, has for long tolerated presumption from subjects such as the notion that they, the rabble, individually, incompetent to handle themselves, somehow are competent through the magic of the franchise to determine the destiny of the state. Conservatives are often accused of laying too great a stress on economic matters. The popular image is of a Wall Street banker in a pinstripe suit. Sorry. It's of a greedy, venal, cold, uncompassionate creature, usually rich. But our reliance on the market economy stems from A, our humility, and B, our dedication to maximizing individual freedom. We don't believe that there exists an individual, nor an elite, nor a system able to fairly and effectively intervene beyond that minimum regulation directed against abuses in the mind-boggling complexity of the market, which is nothing less than the expression in action of the hopes and fears of hundreds of millions of human beings. The market is best left as free as norms of equity permit, because people, we feel, within the bounds of prudence and morality, should be allowed to do what they wish with what they have. This is the thinking that inclines us to accept the dictum of the late Supreme Court Justice George Sutherland, who said, and I quote from him, "The individual has three rights, equally sacred from arbitrary interference: the right to his life, the right to his liberty, the right to his property. These three rights are so bound together as to be essentially one right. To give a man his life, but to deprive him of his liberty, is to take from him all that makes his life worth living. To give him his liberty, but to take from him the property which is the fruit and badge of his liberty, is to still leave him a slave. In other words, the spiritual and material halves of man form one whole and are indivisible. Hurt one, you hurt the other. Give him liberty, but dispossess him of his property, and you have in fact dispossessed him of his liberty, because you have largely taken from him the wherewithal by which he's able to act in society. All totalitarian regimes, right or left, begin by confiscating property, move from that to a curtailment and finally abolishment of formal or political liberty, and move from that quickly into the taking of life. You'll note this in progress today in Chile, where Señor Allende began by the confiscation of property and the nationalization of industry, where he's been moving lately against the independence of the Supreme Court and the bicameral legislature, and just a couple of weeks ago, he finally nationalized the Chilean-owned paper industry, which means that the only existing newspaper in opposition may not have the paper with which to print. And we wonder, how long will it take before Señor Allende, if he encounters any opposition, will end up by the taking of life? The liberal tends to descend from a different order of philosophy. He's the complete Cartesian. That is, he thinks and therefore tends to make an ass of himself. He believes in man's rational, virtual infallibility, which is why he is so prone to tell you that you are wrong, whereas he is right. That his way is the only way to do things, and that if you don't agree with him, then by God, he'll push through a law that compels you into obedience. His, you see, is the arrogance of the intellectual elite. It's irrelevant whether he enacts that law as a dictator or through an intellectual and political oligarchy or by manipulation of the democratic process. The effect is the same. He's in every case attempting to institutionalize and perpetuate his nostrums. He's in every case seeking to stifle dissent, even destroy it, which, of course, Mr. Northcote Parkinson of Parkinson's Law suggests is the salient characteristic of 20th century left liberalism. Its readiness to use whatever political means may be at hand to abolish the opposition. One such means is to commit society to programs from which, given the political realities, there can be no turning back, such as, for example, the minimum wage or Social Security. Another way of diffusing opposition is to intellectually dismiss dissent as Neanderthal, fit only for political limbo. And a third, one more frequently resorted to by the new left descendants of liberalism, is intimidation. This hubris, this Promethean arrogance, stems from the Jacobinism inherent in the liberal ideology. It denies transcendentalism, rejects the ontological paradox, and tends to sum up all of nature in one of its parts, which is, of course, man. It follows that this detranscendentalized biological product of evolution assumes greater importance as a species, as a mass, than as an individual whose claims to a divine nature have been voided and whose claim to specific dignity is no longer so inalienable, certainly not after the manner in which we conceived it in the Declaration of Independence. The evolutionary, determined the evolutionary historical determinism of liberal philosophy will take precedence over the individual. The supposed good of the race overrides the claims of any individual member of that race, in the happy certitude that he is 100% right and that you're absolutely wrong. It's no wonder that you, the voice of dissent, arouse the moral indignation of the liberal. You are evil. You are the enemy. Better to sacrifice you than doom mankind. From this, it shouldn't be difficult to understand how Hitler justified his extermination of 6 million Jews, nor Stalin and Mao their extermination of between 40 and 80 million peasants, depending on whose figures you take, nor terrorists the plastic bombs that shear the legs off children, nor SDSers and black militants the confrontations whose end inevitably is blood. There can be no escaping the evidence of this century. There can be no escaping the responsibility, overwhelmingly, and I defy anybody to overturn this point, overwhelmingly, the death, destruction, and cruelty of this most hideous of epochs have been fomented by the more militant breeds of liberalism. Well, that's the liberals' uglier side, one appalling to the vast majority of good people in America who style themselves liberals, but who not in their most terrible nightmares relate their gentle Menshevism to the central philosophical core. Nevertheless, that philosophical core is as I portray it. And that philosophical core encourages violence and atrocities through its essential failure to respect the sanctity of the individual. It was a fuzzy Fidelista communist who shot down John Kennedy, no right-winger. It was a fuzzy fanatic of the Arab left who murdered his brother Robert Kennedy. It's the left in the United States that hungers so salaciously for the life juices of whomsoever they conceive as the enemy. And it is the arrogant, intolerant, frenzied left whose disrespect for the rights of others is so total that they would seek, as they did in the May Day demonstrations of this past spring, to shut down a government on which tens of millions of fellow citizens depend for everything from a passport to a food stamp. Yet here in this America, we know, the average liberal is well nigh as horrified by the militant New Left as he is by, say, the editorial pages of National Review. He's right now squirming on the hook of his responsibility, on the hook of his conscience, because he knows that he is responsible, that this unlovely contemporary society of ours has been fashioned according to his precepts, and that the militant New Left who would destroy this very society are his children. How did this come about? Why is it that liberalism dooms itself? Well, take one facet of the creed. In his dogmatism, in his certitude of the present, his tendency is to exalt the now without heed to the past and without too much thought for the future. And in his exaltation of the now, along with his detranscendentalization of life, he tends to stress those knowable attributes of the now which are largely material. To him, virtue comes from money. And his rhetoric for years and years and years has been that once man achieves a certain material abundance, he's going to reform, becoming happy, good, a lover of Mozart or Janis Joplin, and a devotee of high literature. He's disconcerted that in our present society of unparalleled abundance in the history of man, man doesn't seem notoriously happy nor notoriously good, and that his higher artistic and intellectual yen seem to be satisfied by the guiding light and bonanza and similar boob-tube fare. Further, the liberal mentality, in its rationalistic positivism, tends to ignore the hierarchical relationship between goods and become enamored of the currently swinging good to the detriment of the whole. This obtains throughout the spectrum of his panaceas, from foreign aid to poverty programs, respecting civil rights, for example, which liberals and conservatives favor alike or should. He rides roughshod over such basic constitutional safeguards as stare decisis, the rule of precedent in constitutional law, forgetting that the ultimate goal is not freedom and dignity for the Negro, but a society governed by principles that guarantee freedom and dignity to all. In his reformist enthusiasms, the liberal tends to ignore all cautioning arguments and those very spiritual or material factors militating against the end he desires to achieve. In short, the liberal incomplete
An understanding of nature is dual, spiritual as well as material, and rationalistically impatient of the wisdom of an Eric Voegelin or Socrates,
and in his arrogance, failing to recognize man's essential fallibility, is destined to louse up his own works and fail. I submit that by his works we know him, that the proof is here to see, the bankrupt society that he's built. Thank you.
We'll have a short break now for about 3 minutes. Those of you who want to go, then we'll have a question and answer period, and then later on for coffee for those of you who want to continue. So those of you can go now. Well, here's your chance.
I used to say shoot before I learned better. Sir? What I feel about what? I'm sorry. Oh, the question is, I'd spoken about maximizing human freedom. I put in the caveat, insofar as one is able to, for the health of a society. And how do I feel about, the freedom of the use of marijuana? Personally, I'm utterly and almost violently opposed to marijuana because I've happened to have had the very tragic experience of seeing friends of mine destroyed by it. As a matter of policy, I feel that it is the burden of the state to prove its case. I feel that the state has a right to prudentially suspend judgment until it can amass the evidence to find out whether something is detrimental to the society as a whole or not. But that the proof of that is the burden of the state. And unfortunately, as far as I personally feel about marijuana, I feel that the state has not proved this, and therefore that marijuana should be legalized for anybody, say, over 18 years of age. Sir? Which question would you like me to answer first? Well, respecting whether Oswald or not pulled the trigger that killed John Kennedy, and respecting as to whether or not he was a communist, as far as I've been able to read, both are true. I've had any number of esoteric theories as to how this happened, and suddenly Oswald was transformed into a follower of Wallace, or something like that. But as far as I can read, it simply is fact and evidence that Oswald did do the shooting, and Oswald certainly was a Fidelista. And this, I happen to believe, is the overwhelming evidence respecting that case. As for what John Birch's and Minutemen may do, precisely, for example, 12 years ago, the National Review read the John Birch Society out of the conservative movement because we believe that Ayn Rand and Mr. Welch, both in their different ways, are not conservative, certainly as we conceive of that rather noble word and that rather noble philosophy. We feel that they are extremists. But I also feel that whenever an allegation is brought up in a floor, a public assembly, that allegation ought to have general provability. Now, when, for example, if I were to give you an example of capitalist treachery, and I quoted from the Daily World, my evidence isn't sufficient, I think, for a public forum unless we are able to investigate that evidence ourselves, because anything that comes from the democratic world, from the Daily World, the communist newspaper, is suspect. And anything that comes from any fanatical source is suspect. So that, for example, if I quoted to you the glories of the Republican Party from a handsheet that came from the GOP, you would have every right to say, well, you're giving me an awfully prejudiced point of view. Anybody I quoted tonight, anybody I quoted tonight, apart from the philosophers, are liberals. When I quoted, for example, about the minimum wage, I quoted liberal sources. When I quoted about the urban renewal, I quoted liberal sources, and generally distinguished sources, sources that we can give credence to. But I would emphasize that the excesses of a John Birch movement is one of the reasons that any responsible conservative simply denies and rejects John Birchism, and rejects, for that matter, anything to do with Wallace.
The point being on the statement there is that you equated like the SDS and some Weathermen with the liberal movement, and I would say that just as the John Birchers and the Minutemen are extremists, so are the SDS.
We can make this point, but see, I would say to you that from our point of view, that the John Birchers are no more to be considered conservatives because of tremendous doctrinal differences than is, say, Hubert Humphrey. We simply do not include them within what we call the new conservative fold, and something that's been developed through the National Review for the last 25 years. That to begin with. But also, we could also say that for every instance, for every single instance that you might have a wild man of the cookie right, which is not conservatism, but a wild man of the cookie right, who is excessive and who creates violence, you have the overwhelming history of these past 60 years where we have had perhaps more than 100 million human beings killed by the excesses of the left. And this is something that not even Minutemen in their wildest dreams would conceive of. It's something that we can't historically deny. Sir? Well, have any of you, for example, read recently The Unheavenly City? It's the point made there, the point that Mr. Banfield makes, and one can take issue with it, but the point that he makes is that our ghetto problems, for example, are not problems of material poverty, nor problems of blacks. We tend to think that all these problems are black problems, but he historically analyzes this, and he goes back to 1815, and he shows how these same problems and these same fears were impacted in those days and impacted through the immigrations of the Irish and the Poles and the Italians and the Jews and so on. So his analysis rests on something that he calls a class difference of philosophy. He divides society up into the upper class, the middle class, the working class, and the low class. And he says that the only way we can rationally discuss these things is to look upon them through these different psychologies. And he says that the psychology, for example, of the low class is one that emphasizes instant gratification because the person of low class background tends to believe that he will not live very long, as for example. And so one of the instant gratifications that he pronounces is an excessive, for example, desire and use of sex. He says that one of the things that you can say about the upper classes is that fellow tends to believe that because that he will have adequate medical care and so on and will live till he is 75 years old, and he will tend to think in terms of his children and even grandchildren, so that you get a broadening of horizon there. Now, what he is talking about is the attitude that is shared by these people. And he says, for example, a playboy has a lower class attitude, a playboy who is rich. So it's not a question of money, it's not a question of race. But what he is talking about is something that I've seen terribly clearly in living for these 13 years so much in the Mediterranean basin, where I've seen poverty such as we do not know it here, where I've seen poverty that is simply not understandable to somebody who draws a welfare check in the United States because there is no welfare to draw, where I've seen poverty that is a question of more than deprivation materially, but of the difficulty of subsistence. Now, these people show one big difference. The difference that I think Mr. Banfield was trying to get at through this sociological examination, but that I get at it another way. And that is the people of the Mediterranean basin are not spiritually deprived. They have an absolute confidence in their importance in this existential framework as creatures of an integral moral worth. And the result of that is that their condition, their material condition is bad, but they haven't been hurt as human beings. They still form value judgments that are excellent value judgments. They are, for example, much more interested in the proper feeding and the proper rearing of their children than they are in a color television set. They still form the right judgments, whereas we know with our spiritually deprived poor that what they do with money is throw it out on pop bottles, for example, or chocolate bars, or the color television set, whereas what may be necessary are things entirely different for the real welfare of their families and their children. Now, these differences are differences that I think are differences of the spirit, and one of the reasons we have failed so abysmally in helping poverty in the United States and poor people in the United States is that we have conceived of it only on the one level, the material level, the level of relative abundance in material matters. And we haven't gone into it in the level of the psychological harm that it does to a human being when he feels that unless he is proved a man, a macho, materially, then he is nobody, he is nothing. And this is something that you find, the great lesson it was for me, to discover this in so many people, Italians and Greeks and Spaniards, and very few French, I might add. But in these people in the Mediterranean basin, that they never for one moment lose that feeling of their absolute importance to the scheme of existence as human beings and their dignity, which cannot be abridged. Is one of the reasons that I spent such a long time there. Sure?
I do have a comment and a question. The comment is concerning the increase in the minimum wage was increase the unemployment rate in minority groups. I don't think that this is the only thing, and I don't think there's a direct relationship. My question is, why do you think conservatives consider Social Security as an attack on the freedom of the individual?
Well, why, may I take your bigger question, the Social Security one, because that's a larger question. Why do we think that Social Security is an attack on the individual? We feel it's more, we feel it's an attack on popular government, on the whole notion of the possibility of having a free popular government. The myth that we all subscribe to is that Joe down there on the corner is somehow selfless enough and somehow wise enough to, on occasion, forget his selfish vested interest and subsume that selfish vested interest in the greater interest of the society as a whole. Now that is, as proponents of democracy or of a republic, what we affirm. This is our faith. Now it can be the willing suspension of disbelief, but this is what we believe in. Well, the roots of this are long and terribly involved, but we know that the great apostle of absolute liberty, John Stuart Mill, wrote a book on liberty, and in that book, in which he extolled the necessity of the sovereign, autonomous individual and his social contract, and the necessity of creating such a state as which will permit this power to remain from where it arises, and that is in the people. He said that the only possibility of creating such a society is if you have an adult, experienced, educated, and responsible citizenship. This is in the second paragraph of his book on liberty, and most people simply overlook that second paragraph. And this is his premise. Now, that is absolutely really what, from a point of view of reality, we mean. Do not mean that Joe the idiot, the corner idiot, or the town Mongolian idiot really can vote sensibly on questions. Nor do we believe that a man who is hired by the mafia is going to vote without self-interest. And we can extend that and say, nor do we believe it is often likely that a man who depends upon his welfare entirely from the government is going to vote against the administration that is giving him those checks every month. We know this, but we make this affirmation of belief. Now, what is wrong with Social Security? Social Security attacks the root of the myth to which we subscribe, because it is awfully difficult for anybody, from the point of view of reason, to really subscribe to that faith if we are talking about citizens who somehow are not able to provide for something as basic as their own survival. If we have citizens, 205 or whatever it is, million citizens, who without exception under Social Security are defined by the law as incompetents in providing for their old age and potential, for example, health problems, then what we have is a citizenry that is not really an independent citizenry. We have wards. We have incompetence. My point during the talk was that I do not know of a case in history where the people have been debased to this level without having changed subtly from being citizens to subjects. And once people become subjects, then they're very close to becoming wards. And once they become wards or helots of the state, then the state assumes an arrogance, or whoever rules the state. And that arrogance says, good God Almighty, why do we let these idiots vote? Why do we permit them this presumption when they're really not even able to brush their teeth unless we do it for them and make them do it? So that we feel as conservatives that these programs may be wrong for many other reasons, but primarily the reason we oppose them is because we feel that these programs take away the kind of responsibility that the individual sovereign citizen must have in order to exercise freedom, in order to justify his freedom, and in order to justify the myth of democracy. And we believe in it. We believe it's possible. But we don't believe that it's possible if the individual citizen across the land is made into a sheep. Sir? Your question, I'm not quite sure what your question is. Your question is how is it that, I'm not quite sure what it is.
My question is, why has this trend toward,
Towards the maximization of the franchise, why is that the trend?
why has this trend toward denying people their dignity come with the trend toward expanding the franchise?
Well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure I'm answering your question. Would you correct me if I'm not answering your question? I'll try to, okay? We had at first, because most reasonable men did not believe that a person who did not have a stake in society was qualified to exercise the franchise, we had in the beginning of this republic such things as property qualifications for the franchise. Now, property was deemed of in one way in this nation where we had an awful lot of free land, and that was real property. I would say that any sophisticated analysis of this could extend it, obviously, to include an automobile, to include educational degrees, to include lots of other things. Then the franchise was extended and has been extended yearly. Why not the 15-year-old vote tomorrow, as for example? We have the franchise given now to people who can't read English. And how in the world they're going to make a reasonable decision about our political process if they can't read English is beyond me. But when you have this kind of thing, then you have the phenomenon, as you point out, that the people tend to vote for more and more of these federal programs. Now, how is it, you ask, that it happens? I say it's very natural. Because to the extent that you have a franchise extrapolated to a level of society that never had been conceived of as responsible enough to make that sort of faith work, then what you have is more and more people voting for their self-interest and to hell with the rest of society, and voting for the easiest thing there is, and that is for Washington to do the job. And when you have this kind of thing, then what you have is the destruction of the republic. And what you have after that, finally, is the despair of the democracy and the despair of the demos, and then you have the sort of thing that worries me now and I think should concern us all, and that is the increasing desire in the United States for a savior. People don't vote for Wallace because he's handsome. They vote for him because he claims to be a savior. People didn't vote for John Kennedy because he had anything in the world to say of any intellectual content about any issue on the face of this earth. But they voted for him because he was elegant and aristocratic, and Republicans love aristocrats, arrogant and aristocratic, and he proposed to be a savior. Mr. Nixon is disliked because, my Lord, can you imagine trying to make a savior out of that physiognomy? It's impossible. But I do suggest that if we had Muskie running for president and John Lindsay running for vice president, we'd have an unbeatable combination. Because Mr. Lindsay, I know, being the Rudolph Valentino of liberal hopefuls, knows that he can save the world just as he saved New York City. This is the kind of thing you get when you have the franchise extended beyond reasonable lengths. And what you get finally is a lowering of the responsibility of the electorate, and finally Pepsodent smiles become our political leaders. That's something that's typical to judge in absolutely every case and every situation in history. But I would say that, for example, reasonable length would be this, that a man should understand English, should be able to read it. I would say that a reasonable length in another case would be that a man should have a certain amount of experience in real life, not, for example, in a university, because I think these things don't tend to be always identical. I think that a reasonable limitation on the franchise ought to be this, that a man before he votes declares that he does uphold the Constitution of the United States. It's rather odd when you have the rules of the game, which imply that we're going to play the rules of the Constitution, and yet so many voters nowadays, I've heard, are saying, but it's precisely the Constitution they don't support. So you're having somebody playing Monopoly except with some other chips. And this kind of thing I think is reasonable. Sir? Absolutely. In 1964, the GOP platform, Goldwater's platform, which possibly was the most conservative platform we'll ever see, that one had as one of the principles of the platform in the social domestic policies will be to provide training for such people. So, to point out where training programs are excellent, they're an excellent investment. Another element in that program was to provide exemptions under the minimum wage, temporary exemptions, so that people could learn technical skills. And another thing that Mr. Goldwater pointed out that we had to do was to break up union monopolies. We should put unions under the Sherman Antitrust Act, just as we have other power concentrations, so that you do not have, as for example in New York City, the electrical union simply refusing to hire Negroes. This is one of the greatest cases of outrageous segregation that we have continuing in this land. And I do not know a politician in New York City who gets up on his hind legs outside of my brother James who will talk about this and denounce it in public. So we do have, for this kind of case, we have our plans, we have our counter proposals. What we suggest is, however, that the psychology of running to Papa, Great White Father in Washington, is a bad psychology for anybody. It was certainly bad for the Red Indians, and it's bad for us now. We feel that the only way that we can create a virile society able to bear the burden of freedom, which is a very horrible burden. It's a sweet price, but it's a horrible burden. That is a society that is willing to accept the responsibility as far as possible for its own destiny in the individual, on the level of the community, and on the level of the state. I, as a Southerner, son of Southern parents, for example, shed few tears over the Southern states who cried about governmental federal interference in their home policies when throughout the Roosevelt years they were swilling at the federal trough. I feel that that kind of thing, if you ask for Papa government to help you, Papa government will guide you. And it depends on what you're willing to give up and what you think is worth getting. But our feeling as conservative is that this will not maximize the individual's freedom and will bring about an oppressive society. Sir? Why did you ask that question? Next question. I'll give you an answer on President Nixon. I think President Nixon is instinctually a conservative, and he has certainly shocked conservatives over the last year. He is also a political animal, which any man has to be if he becomes president or anything. But at the moment, for example, I would not back Mr. Nixon for a second term unless it were a case of faute de mieux. Unless it were the case that I would have, for example, the second coming of Hubert Humphrey as an opponent, or Mr. Johnson running for history again, or somebody else like that. I wouldn't go for Nixon. I would prefer Governor Reagan. Sir, someone who hasn't asked a question? Listen, those of you who have asked a question, I want to come back to you if everybody wants it, but I'd like to get people who haven't asked a question to shoot. Go ahead. Do I think that Mr. Agnew was a conservative before?